Picture this. You're walking through the streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. The air is thick with the smell of burning incense, and the sounds of bustling crowds echo off the stone walls. But something's off. There's an unsettling energy in the air. A sense of impending doom that makes your skin prickle. In the distance, you see the emperor, Nero, striding through the forum with a strange, unsettling figure beside him. It's a woman, but something's wrong. There's something not quite human about her. Little do you know, this strange procession will be the beginning of a tragedy so horrifying. It will haunt the pages of history forth. The air in the tower that morning was unlike anything I had ever felt before, thick, suffocating and saturated with the weight of unspoken histories. The fog clung to the stone walls like a dark veil, as if the very ground beneath our feet had absorbed the sorrow of countless souls who had perished within this grim fortress. There was an unnatural stillness to everything, a silence so deep it seemed as if even the wind had been cautioned to remain at bay. I stood in the courtyard, my breath visible in the cold air, and I could hear only the soft shuffle of guards' boots on the gravel. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it almost deafening against the oppressive quiet round me. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen, waiting for the inevitable. Though I had never met her, this woman who was about to be executed, I had heard enough whispers, seen enough fleeting glances exchanged behind closed doors, and of Cleves, a name that was once spoken with admiration, now only a shadow of contempt. Her marriage to King Henry VIII had been little more than a cruel political maneuver, one that had unraveled in bitter disillusionment and public humiliation. Her face flashed in my mind, pale and drawn, the once royal features now marked by sorrow and loss, the tremor in her voice when she had spoken to me just a fortnight ago echoed in my memory. She had seemed composed then, as if the walls round her had closed in too many times to frighten her any more. But the desperation that flickered in her eyes, a desperation she tried so hard to conceal, had been undeniable. It haunted me. We had shared little more than a few polite exchanges, but in those brief moments I had caught a glimpse of something beyond the royal mask she wore. She was a woman who had been betrayed by the very man who had sworn to love her, Henry, who had once seen her as a means to secure his throne, had grown repulsed by her. Not because of any fault of hers, no. She was beautiful, graceful in her own way, but because she did not fit the image of what he wanted. She was not the woman he had dreamed of. She was a disappointment, and for that, she was cast aside. The rumors had spread like wildfire. The king had sought her beauty in vain, and when he found it lacking, he discarded her as if she were little more than a broken trinket. His wrath had come swift and unforgiving. He had grown tired of her, and now she stood at the precipice of the ultimate punishment, and face in the courtroom had been a mask of dignity. Though I could see the tension beneath her composed features, she had tried to remain strong, to appear unfazed by the fate that loomed over her. But there was something in the way her hands trembled, a small but telling sign of the internal battle she fought every day. The woman who had been the Queen of England, who had been chosen to wear the crown by the king's will, was now a prisoner, waiting for the executioner's axe. As I watched her now, I realized how deeply she had been broken by this betrayal. Her marriage, once a promising union, had turned to ash in her hands. She had tried to find solace in the comforts of court life, but those had slipped through her fingers, leaving her isolated in the cold, grim walls of the tower. This was the fate of so many before her, those who dared to become pawns in the royal game, only to be cast aside when they no longer served their purpose. Yet Anne's suffering was not just that of a discarded wife. It was a torment far deeper than any of us could fully comprehend. I had heard whispers that she had tried to flee, that she had begged for a mercy from the king, But it was all for naught. Her fate was sealed long before she ever set foot inside the tower. And now, the cold stone walls would bear witness to the end of her story. I watched her as she walked past me, escorted by guards who seemed to hesitate in their steps, as though they, too, felt the weight of what was about to transpire. Her head was held high, her expression a strange mixture of resignation and defiance. She walked like a woman who had come to accept the inevitability of her fate, but whose spirit refused to be broken entirely. I could see the flicker of something, perhaps the ghost of a woman who once dreamed of a future filled with love, with power, with belonging, but those dreams had long been shattered. As the crowd gathered, murmuring amongst themselves, I couldn't help but wonder what went through Anne's mind in those final moments. Did she recall the lavish court she had once known? Did she think of her family, her homeland, the life she had been promised? Or did she finally understand that her life had never truly been hers to begin with? That the choices made for her were not hers, that the king had never loved her as a woman, but only as a tool for his own desires? I could not know, but as she reached the scaffold, the fear that had once gripped her seemed to fade into something else. She stood there, alone in the sea of faces, her back straight, her chin lifted slightly, as though defying not just the king, but the entire world that had brought her to this point. It was then that the full horror of the moment became clear to me. This was not just the death of a woman. This was the death of an idea, the idea that anyone, no matter their title, their beauty, or their worth, could escape the cruel hand of fate when the king's wrath was upon them. Anne had been more than a victim of Henry's whims. She had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, a pawn in the hands of a king whose desires knew no bounds. The executioner raised his axe, the sound of it cutting through the silence like a knife. The crowd held its breath, and Anne, for the first time, closed her eyes. Her final breath left her body like a whisper, carried away by the wind. And with it, she vanished into the history that would never remember her as she once was. The chill in the air that morning seemed to hang heavy, pressing down on everything it touched. The thick fog clung to the stone walls of the tower, muting the sounds of the world beyond, inside. The flickering torchlight cast strange, restless shadows across the floor, bending and stretching like the ghosts of the past, waiting for something or someone, and then it came. I was standing just beyond the archway when the guards brought her out. Her hands were bound tightly with rough, frayed rope, the fibers cutting into her skin, but she showed no sign of pain. The rusted metal gleamed dully in the dim morning light, a cruel reminder of the fate she was about to face. Anne of Cleves, the woman who had once worn the crown of England, now reduced to nothing more than a prisoner, a shadow of the royal life she had once known. She didn't cry out. She didn't plead for mercy. There was nothing in her expression that suggested fear, nothing. It was as though she had already crossed over into a place where the pain of the world could no longer touch her. She walked with an eerie calmness, her face pale, almost serene. But those eyes were different. There was a sharpness to them that didn't belong on the face of a woman about to die. It was as though she had already witnessed the end of her story and accepted it. Or perhaps no. Understood it. I followed her through the twisting, narrow corridors of the tower, the scent of old wood and damp stone overpowering my senses. The air felt thick, as if the very walls were suffocating us, holding our breath in a way that made every step heavier than the last. The sounds of our footsteps echoed off the cold stone, filling the silence in a way that only seemed to make the tension more unbearable. As I moved closer to Anne, I couldn't help but notice how still the air was round her. There was a strange energy surrounding her, something that felt out of place in the grim setting of the tower. I wasn't too sure if it was the calmness she exuded or the unsettling sense of inevitability that hung round her like a shroud. She seemed at peace, but there was something in the way she moved, something ancient and unsettling that unsettled me to my very core. She passed by me without a glance, her eyes forward and focused, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Yet, even without looking at me, I could feel her presence in a way I couldn't explain. It was like a ripple in the air, a subtle disturbance that tugged at the edges of my mind. My skin prickled, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. There was something in her stillness that drew me in. Something I couldn't quite put into words. And then, just as she moved past me, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible laugh. Distant yet piercing, as though carried by the wind itself. It was a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't a laugh of joy or mirth, it was something else entirely dark, hollow. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, my breath catching in my throat. I looked round, my pulse quickening, but no one else seemed to have heard it. The guards, the other witnesses, none of them reacted. But I heard it. I knew I had. That laugh, it lingered in the air, drifting like a whisper. I couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong. Like something had shifted. Something had broken between the worlds of the living and the dead, and was not the only one crossing into another realm. There was a palpable shift, a tearing of the very fabric of the tower, and I felt it deep in my bones. Anne, it seemed, had already walked past the point of return, and all that remained was a shadow. But what disturbed me most was not the eerie presence she carried with her. No. It was the way the others, those who walked beside her, those who watched in silence, seemed to be affected. They were the ones who flinched, their eyes darting nervously round as if they feared something unseen. The unease was written across their faces, though they didn't dare show it. I could see it in the way their hands trembled slightly, the subtle quickening of their breath, the way their eyes flickered nervously toward Anne as if afraid she might turn and look at them. None of them understood what she had become. None of them knew that she was no longer the woman they had once known. She was something more, something older, something that had crossed a threshold they could not comprehend. They feared her now, in a way that had nothing to do with the punishment that awaited her, but everything to do with the strange power she had unlocked in herself. I followed them through the endless, twisting halls, my feet dragging as the weight of the atmosphere seemed to press down on me. Every step seemed to echo, bouncing off the stone like the ticking of a clock, marking the passing of time with relentless precision. Anne's steps were slow, deliberate. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, as if she were already standing on the precipice of her fate. But for a moment, I swear, I saw something in her eyes, something that shouldn't have been there. It was as if she could see it to the abyss. And, perhaps, in that brief moment, she wondered if it had always been waiting for her. Was this fate? Or had she somehow crossed paths with it? A distant door creaked open ahead, and the light from the courtyard spilled into the dim corridors, casting long, strange shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. Anne's face remained composed. But something flickered behind her eyes. The quiet resignation she wore like a cloak began to unravel, and I thought I saw something more, a flicker of defiance, a shred of unspoken rage. But just as quickly, it was gone, swallowed up by the silent void of her journey. As the procession moved closer to the scaffold, the whispering began again, this time louder, more insistent. I heard it on the wind, carried through the ancient stone of the tower. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it wasn't Anne's voice. It wasn't even human. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew, in that moment, that I was caught up in something far darker than I could have ever imagined. Something ancient had been awakened in the very walls of the tower, and Anne, the woman condemned by king's cruelty, had become its unwilling vessel. The curse she had unknowingly embraced would claim her, but it would not release her so easily. No, her story was far from over. The tower would not let her go, and neither would I. They placed her on a makeshift throne, a simple, cold stone chair, starkly different from the grandeur she had once envisioned when she first dreamed of sitting beside the king on the royal days. This chair was a far cry from the golden, bejeweled throne of her past fantasies. It was raw and unforgiving, just like her fate. The scaffold loomed behind her, a towering reminder of her impending doom. The men who stood round her were oddly stiff, their hands trembling in the elaborate folds of their regal finery. The spectacle of it all weighed heavily in the air, their faces, usually composed, betrayed a growing discomfort, an unsettling sense of uncertainty. They could not mask their unease, no matter how high their station or how impeccable their appearance. The tower had a way of doing that to people. It stripped them of their pretenses, made them small in the face of something far greater than their titles. Even the highest in the land could feel the oppressive weight of history pressing down on them here. As Anne sat in that cold chair, I could feel the weight of every eye in the courtyard on her. It was not just her fate at stake. This was the king's display of power, of dominance. She had failed him, and now she would pay. The king's wrath had no room for mercy, and she was about to become the living embodiment of that cruelty. It was a spectacle, a display of public punishment designed to remind everyone of the cost of defiance. She had been stripped of her title, her dignity, and now she would be stripped of her life. But what struck me as most unusual, what made my blood run cold, was the look in Anne's eyes. There was no terror, no trembling lips or pleading gaze. Instead, there was something far darker. A chilling resolve settled over her, like an ancient curse woven into her soul, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, in the face of death, and did not shrink. She stood taller than ever, as though she had already stepped into a realm where the rules of the living no longer applied. She slowly turned her head, her eyes scanning the courtyard, as if searching for something or someone. For a brief moment, our gazes met. I saw it in her eyes, an intense and wavering focus, as if she were searching for answers to questions that only she knew. And then, as if I were nothing more than a fleeting shadow in the crowd, her gaze moved past me, leaving me with a strange sense of abandonment. It was as though she had already left us, already crossed over to a place where the physical world no longer mattered. It was then that I heard it, so faint, so delicate that I almost doubted my own ears. Her whisper, barely audible, yet carrying with it the weight of something terrible. Revenge. The word seemed to hang in the air, its resonance reverberating through the cold stone of the tower, sending a chill through me so deep that it felt as though my bones had frozen in place. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the temperature shift, as though a shadow had passed over us. It was as if something ancient and dark had awakened with that single word, and it was watching us, lurking just beyond the reach of light. The sense of dread in the courtyard thickened, pressing down on us like a heavy blanket, suffocating every breath. I looked round, but no one else spoke. They could not have heard it. Or perhaps they had, but did not want to acknowledge the weight of it. I saw the others shifting uneasily, glancing at one another with that same nervous tension in their faces. The usual composure of the court had dissolved, replaced with something far more primal. They were unnerved, and I couldn't help but feel that they, too, were caught in the grip of something that none of us understood. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Anne's face. Her calmness had twisted into something far more unsettling. It was as though she knew something none of us did, something so terrifying. so deeply ingrained in the fabric of history, that it would haunt us for generations to come. The faint smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. Not of joy or mockery, but of something darker, and understanding that we were all mere players in a game that she had long ago accepted. The depth of her resolve, her acceptance, felt almost like an invitation into the unknown, into a realm where death held no dominion over her. I couldn't help but feel that Anne had already crossed into that realm. She was already beyond the reach of the executioner's axe, beyond the grasp of the king's wrath. She was already walking in the shadow of something far older, far more terrible than any of us could comprehend. And in that moment, I understood Anne's fate was not just hers to bear. It was the culmination of centuries of history, the echoes of countless other lives who had suffered in the same way, who had been broken by the wheel of power and revenge. It was a cycle that could not be escaped, and had become a symbol of that cycle, a living representation of the twisted and yielding nature of power. But what haunted me most, what stayed with me long after the crowd had dispersed and the day had drawn to a close, was that look in her eyes, the stillness of a woman who had embraced her destiny, who had made peace with the inevitable. The faintest trace of a secret smile lingered, as if she were the only one who truly understood the game that was being played, a game that had already been lost, long before she had ever stepped foot in that cold, unforgiving courtyard. Anne of Cleves was no longer just a woman about to face her execution. She had become something else, something that transcended her death, something that would linger in the shadows of history for years to come. And no matter how many centuries passed, no matter how many rulers came and went, her story would remain in the dark corners of the tower, waiting to be remembered. That night, the tower seemed to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just the cold that crept under the door, nor the usual whispers of stone that groaned with age. This was different. The shadows stretched longer, thicker, as though the very walls of the tower were breathing, exhaling the misery of centuries past. I had not been able to sleep since Anne's execution. Her quiet acceptance, the way she had met her fate with a resigned calmness, plagued me. Her stillness was a haunting presence that refused to leave me, no matter how many times I turned my pillow, trying to escape the weight of it. I found myself pacing the cold stone floors of my quarters, trying to shake off the unsettling sensation that I was being watched. The air was heavier than it should have been, pressing down on my chest as if the tower itself were aware of my every move. My footsteps echoed off the cold, unfeeling walls, a constant reminder of my isolation. The silence in the corridors was oppressive, the kind of silence that feels wrong, like something is just beyond the edge of perception, waiting to emerge. Then I heard it. At first, it was so faint, so delicate that I thought I might have imagined it, the soft rustling of fabric, like the fluttering of a garment in the wind. But there was no wind. The tower was still, suffocatingly still. The usual creaks of the ancient structure were absent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my pulse quickening. I tried to calm myself, to brush off the tension in my limbs, but the sound persisted, getting louder, closer, as if something or someone was moving in the dark. I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my ears, and there, standing in the doorway, was Anne. It was as though she had stepped out of the shadows themselves. Her figure was pale, almost translucent in the dim light, as ghostly as the mist that filled the tower at dawn. The contours of her face were soft, almost serene, but there was something in her eyes, something that made my blood run cold. Her eyes were wide and empty, yet they seemed to fixate on me with a chilling intensity, as if they could see right through me, through my very soul. The air in the room grew impossibly colder, and the warmth I had clung to drained from my body. I felt my heart stutter in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears as if trying to drown out the dread that curled in my stomach. The silence between us stretched too long. The shadows seemed to crowd in, wrapping round me, suffocating me with the unbearable stillness. You heard it too, didn't you? Her voice, soft and strained, broke through the silence like a knife. It was barely audible, but it carried with it a weight that seemed to settle in the pit of my stomach. I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me. My mouth felt dry, as if the words had been stolen from me. "What do you mean?" I asked, but my voice barely rose above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I truly wanted to know. "The whispering," she said, her smile crooked, almost playful in the way it tugged at the corner of her lips, but it was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "They want something from us, something that won't be given." Her words hung in the air like a dark omen, swirling round me, sinking into the walls. There was no mistaking the gravity in her voice, the bitter resignation that tainted her words. It was as if she had crossed into a realm where time and space no longer made sense. She was no longer the woman I had once seen in the courtyard, no longer the queen. No longer even a woman bound by flesh. She had become something else, something far more terrible. A part of the tower itself, as though she had merged with the suffering of its past. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes from her form. The chill in the room deepened, the cold wrapping itself round my heart, squeezing tighter with each passing second. I wanted to speak, to ask her what she meant, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. What had she become? What had she learned in the moments before her death? Before I could make sense of my thoughts, Anne's figure flickered, like a candle flame caught in the wind, and just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Her form dissolved into the shadows, vanishing into the blackness that clung to the corners of the room. For a moment, I stood there, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, my heart racing in my chest. The silence returned. But it was not the same as before. It was empty, hollow, like a space where something important had been lost. The cold in the room felt unnatural, like the very bones of the tower had turned against me. The walls seemed to close in, as if they, too, were aware of Anne's ghostly presence. Her words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over, a chilling refrain. Asterisk, they want something from us, something that won't be given. Asterisk, who was she talking about? Who, asterisk, wanted, asterisk, something from her, from us? The question gnawed at me, burrowing deep into the pit of my stomach, but I could find no answer. And yet I felt it deep in my bones, and had not been the only one affected by the sinister presence of the tower. No, it was something much older than she, something that had existed long before her. It had always been here, watching, waiting, and now it was awake. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The shadows in the room felt heavier, darker. The whispering Anne had spoken of had not stopped. It had only grown louder, more insistent. Like a hissing wind that carried voices in the dark, I looked around. But I was alone, no one was there. Yet I could still hear them, the faint voices, just at the edge of my hearing, murmuring words I couldn't make out. A feeling of suffocating dread settled over me, the air thick and oppressive. I was not alone. Anne's presence lingered in the room, her spectre wrapped in the cold silence of the tower. I didn't know what it meant, what she had become, but one thing was certain. The tower had claimed her, and now it had claimed me, too. Her warning still echoed in my mind as I sat down, my hands trembling, my heart racing. It was only then, in the suffocating quiet, that I realized the tower had never been just a prison for the living. It was a prison for the dead, too. And in this place, nothing ever truly left. The next morning arrived with a cold bite in the air, a thick fog that wrapped itself round the tower like a shroud, as though the world itself mourned the fate of Anne. I stood among the crowd, the same crowd that had gathered time and time again to witness the king's justice. But this was different. This was not the usual spectacle. There was something darker, more profound in the very air. The whispers, the ones I had heard in the night, in the shadows of the tower, had returned. They swirled around us like a terrible storm, whispering to each other, drowning out everything else. The sounds of the crowd, the clatter of feet against stone, the sharp commands of the guards, all of it faded into a hum. Only the whispers remained, and they felt too close, too personal, as if the very walls were listening, waiting for something terrible to happen. Anne was brought out once again, her hands bound, her feet dragging as if the weight of the world was upon her. But this time, there was no serene acceptance in her expression. There was no hint of the calm she had shown the day before. No, today her face was twisted with emotion, rage, perhaps, or something deeper, something more sinister. The fierce light in her eyes made her appear less like the woman who had once been promised the crown of England, and more like a figure from some forgotten legend, an avenger, a spirit with a purpose. Far beyond her execution, I could see it in her eyes, that terrible and dying fire. It was a fire that refused to be extinguished, a fire that would not be snuffed out by the king's blade or the executioner's hand. Anne was no longer just a woman walking to her death. She had become something more. And in that moment, I realized the truth. She was not the victim. No, she was the one who had transcended the role of a mere pawn. She had become the embodiment of something else, something far darker. As they led her toward the scaffold, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, a pressure building in my chest. My hands trembled, and I felt my breath quicken, as if something terrible was about to unfold. The crowd seemed to sense it too. There was an edge in the air, a tautness that wasn't there the day before. Even the guards, usually so unshakable, seemed to hesitate, their eyes flickering nervously, the usual jeering, the usual calls of approval for the king's justice. None of that came. It was as though the entire world held its breath, waiting, and then, as Anne stood upon the scaffold, her back straight, her head held high, something shifted. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, a glance, a look, perhaps directed toward me. Her gaze locked with mine, and in that instant, I felt a pang of sympathy, a deep, aching sorrow for her fate. But it wasn't just sorrow. There was something else, something far more unsettling, in the way her eyes bored into mine. It wasn't fear, nor regret. It was defiance, and in that brief moment, I realized with a chill that she was no longer asking for mercy. She was offering something else entirely, a warning. Or perhaps a curse. I couldn't tell. I couldn't understand. But I knew in my bones that whatever was about to happen was not going to be what anyone expected. The executioner, his hood drawn low over his face, raised his axe high, the glint of the blade catching the dim light of the morning sun. And then, with the most terrible of finality, he brought it down. The sound of the blade hitting its mark was sharp, but the moment it landed, something happened. A gust of wind swept through the courtyard, rattling the ancient stone walls. It felt like a breath of final exhalation from the tower itself. A strange hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, there was no sound, only the whistling of the wind. But it wasn't the end. It wasn't the release Anne had been promised. She had not been given the quiet death of a victim. No, there was more to this. There was something far worse waiting for her. For as the crowd stood, frozen, eyes wide in shock, I noticed it. The subtle movement of her body, still twitching ever so slightly, as if she had not fully succumbed to the blade, as if, somehow, she was still here, still present, lingering in the air, refusing to fade away. I could not tear my eyes from her. Anne, her head now resting on the cold stone, her once beautiful face drained of life, yet her expression was one of something. Something that made my chest tighten. There was no serenity, no final peace. Instead, there was a faint, crooked smile that tugged at her lips, a smile so faint, so impossible, that it sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though the last breath she had drawn had been stolen from her, trapped between worlds, as though she was not gone at all, but suspended in the space between the living and the dead. The feeling that filled the courtyard was not relief or closure. It was something far more. Unsettling, a quiet ripple of fear passed through the crowd. The whispers, the same whispers I had heard in the tower, returned. They swirled round us again, louder now, more insistent. But this time, they were not just in the air. They were in our minds, in our hearts. A presence, unseen but deeply felt, lingered in the space where Anne had fallen. The coldness in the air deepened, and I realized with dread that something had shifted. Anne was not just dead. She had transcended it, had become something else entirely, a part of the tower, a part of this place, a part of the curse that had been woven into its very foundation. And as I stood there, watching the executioner step away, his task completed, I understood with a sickening certainty that this was not the end of her story. No, Anne of Cleves had become something far more dangerous than any of us had imagined. She had become a ghost, a force, a symbol of something that would never fade, never die. The whispers had begun, and I was afraid, truly afraid, that they would never stop. I expected silence, a breathless, mournful quiet, as though the entire world would hold its breath in respect for the tragedy that had just unfolded. I imagined that, in the wake of Anne's death, there would be nothing but the stillness of the tower, broken only by the whispering winds and the soft shuffle of feet. Yet, the moment her body hit the cold stone of the scaffold, the world round me seemed to freeze. Time itself seemed to pause, as though the very essence of life had been sucked out of the air, leaving us suspended in a state of eerie calm. But then, in the distance, I heard it. A thudding sound. My heart beat, deafening in my ears, bounded with a force I had never felt before, as if my own pulse had become a separate entity, insistent and relentless. It drowned out everything else, until it felt as though the entire world was pressing in on me, closing me off from anything real, from anything human. I could feel the blood rushing in my temples. But beneath it, I could sense something else, something far darker, a void. A space that filled with a strange, unexplainable sensation. I waited, but nothing came. Not the stillness I had expected, nor the wailing that so often follows such silence. Instead, a murmur began to rise from the crowd, soft at first, but growing louder, as if the very masses themselves had awakened from the stupor of the execution, a murmur that was not of grief, but something deeper, more unsettling. It wasn't the sorrow of watching a life extinguished. No, it was something else. Something far older, far more primal. The wind picked up suddenly, almost as if it had been stirred by some invisible force, and I could feel it biting at my skin. The voices that had started as soft whispers now swirled round me, carried by the wind, fluttering through the air like ghostly tendrils. They were no longer contained within the crowd, but seemed to seep into the very walls of the tower. The sound of them, faint and fragmented, sent chills down my spine, yet I couldn't understand what they were saying. The words were fun, unintelligible, like a language that belonged to another time, another realm. The silence, the one I had so desperately awaited, was slipping away, replaced by a deeper, more disturbing kind of noise. The murmurs, the whispers, the wind, they all felt connected, as if Anne's death had unleashed something from within the tower's ancient walls, something that had been buried there for centuries, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Anne had been silenced, yes, but her presence lingered in the very air around us. It clung to the space where she had fallen, like a ghost unwilling to depart. The cold stone beneath her body seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't name, as if it had absorbed her life force and now held it captive. The courtyard, once filled with the noise of the crowd, now felt as though it had become a mausoleum, a sacred place where the dead still walked. The shadows cast by the scaffold seemed darker, deeper, as though they were growing longer, stretching out to swallow us all. I tried to shake off the sense of dread that gripped me, but it was impossible. The feeling was all-encompassing, like a weight settling in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I was not the only one who felt it. The crowd, once restless, had become strangely still. Their movements slow and deliberate, as if something invisible was holding them in place. They, too, could feel the presence that had filled the air and spirit, or something darker, more ancient. I turned my gaze to the scaffold, to Anne's still form, and for a moment I wondered if I had truly witnessed her death. Had the execution really been carried out, or had it all been some horrible, surreal dream? Anne's body lay there, but it was as if she had never truly left. There was no finality in her death, no peace in her stillness. Instead, there was only a haunting emptiness, an absence that filled the space around her. It was as if she had slipped through the cracks of this world and into something else entirely, a place where death held no dominion, where even the king's command could not bind her. I felt an overwhelming urge to move, to get away from the scene, but my feet remained rooted to the ground, and willing to obey the command of my mind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just in the wind. Now, they seemed to be everywhere, crawling under my skin, twisting round my thoughts. I couldn't focus. My head spun, and I felt as though I might collapse right then and there, as if the weight of it all, Anne's death, the whispers, the cold air, the oppressive presence was too much to bear. Then, something else happened. Something I can never explain, something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The wind, which had been soft and gentle, shifted again. It rose with a force, howling through the courtyard, as though the very air itself was rejecting the death that had just occurred. The whispers became louder, clearer, and for the briefest of moments I could make out the words. They were not in a language I could understand, but they were unmistakable, full of ancient power. The voices spoke of vengeance, of unyielding fate, of a curse that would never be lifted. I felt my heart race, my body trembling under the weight of those words. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the wind died down. The whispers faded into nothingness, leaving behind only the heavy silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the tower itself was holding its breath. My chest tightened, and for the first time since I had entered that cursed place, I felt truly alone. The crowd began to disperse, their movements sluggish, as if they were waking from a shared nightmare. The guards stood motionless, their eyes distant, their faces pale. No one spoke, and no one dared to meet each other's gaze. The whispers, the wind, Anne's ghostly presence, they had all disappeared, leaving only the echo of their lingering effects. But I knew, deep in my bones, that what I had witnessed that day was not the end. It was only the beginning. Anne's death had not closed the chapter on her story. It had opened a door to something far darker, a door that would remain open forever, and I had unwittingly become a part of it. The silence that followed Anne's death was not the peaceful calm I had expected. It was something much worse. A silence full of unspeakable things, waiting to be unleashed. And I knew that no matter how far I tried to run, I could never escape what had been set in motion that day. That night, I felt it most strongly, the dread that settled into the very bones of the tower, as if the ancient stones had absorbed Anne's final moments, her anger, her sorrow, and perhaps even her curse. I could feel it now, creeping through the air, a dark, tangible force pressing against me. It was as though something in the tower had shifted, had been awakened, and it was alive, breathing, waiting, growing stronger with each passing hour. I could not sleep. The walls of my quarters seemed to close in round me, the familiar stone now suffocating, pressing against my chest, as if the tower itself had become a prison far darker than I had ever imagined. My thoughts were not my own, but haunted by images of Anne, her eyes, wide and full of a torment that could never be expressed in words. Those eyes, the last thing I had seen before she died, kept returning to me. They seemed to follow me, even when I closed my eyes. A cold sweat covered my skin as I recalled that final look she had given me. It wasn't one of fear. No, it was something far more unsettling. It was rage, pure and raw, a rage that burned with a fire that would not die. I couldn't escape her. Her presence clung to me like a second skin, and even though I was alone in my bed, I could feel her. Asterisk, she was still here. Asterisk, it was a thought I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. And it wasn't just in my dreams, during the day. I would catch glimpses of her shadow in the corners of the hallways, a fleeting movement. Just beyond the edge of my vision, a dark, distorted shape that made my heart race. But when I turned, when I focused my gaze, it was always gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. At night, the whispers began. Soft at first, almost like the wind. But they weren't the usual sounds of the tower, no. These were different. These were words. Anne's voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The voice that had whispered her last words to me now returned in the silence of the night. It scraped against my mind like the scratch of a blade across stone, urging me, pulling at me, like a tendril of something dark that refused to let go. Asterisk, remember. Asterisk, she whispered, the word dragging itself through the stillness of the room, lingering in the air like the scent of decay. Asterisk, remember what they did to me. Asterisk, I wanted to scream, to cover my ears, to block it out, but I couldn't. I had never been more terrified in my life. It was as if her very presence was still here, as if she were watching me from the shadows, waiting for something, waiting for me to understand something I could not comprehend. What I could never forget, what would haunt me for the rest of my days, was the final look Anne had given me as she died. I had thought it would be a look of peace, of release. But it wasn't. It was a look of something darker, something far more chilling. Her rage had been palpable, but there was something else in those eyes. Something more than just anger. It was as if, in those last moments, she had understood the futility of it all. The hopelessness of being cast aside by the very man who had once sworn to love her. But more than that, it was as if she knew that death would not be the end of her. No, her spirit, her curse, would live on. She had become part of the tower, part of its stone, part of its history. And now she was dragging me into it. That night, the whispers became louder, more insistent. They were no longer just in the air. They were in my mind, scratching at my thoughts, pulling me deeper into their grasp. I could hear Anne's voice in every corner of the tower, in every shadow. It was as if she was asterisked everywhere, asterisk, as if the tower had become a living, breathing entity, and Anne had become a part of it, woven into its very fabric. I couldn't escape her, no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to block it out. I could hear her, her voice, her presence, her rage. As I lay in my bed that night, I could feel the weight of her eyes on me, still watching me, even though I knew she was dead. The curse had been laid upon me, and there was no escape. The tower had claimed her, and now it had claimed me as well. The very air around me felt thick with her presence, her anger, her need for revenge. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood the power of a curse. The darkness that had been Anne's companion in life had now become mine. It would follow me wherever I went. The whispers, the shadowy movements in the corners of my vision, the coldness that clung to my skin, they were all a part of it. Anne's curse had been woven into the very bones of the tower, and now I was tangled in it, unable to break free. I turned in my bed, my mind a maelstrom of confusion and fear. Sleep was impossible. Her face, her eyes those wide, haunting eyes flashed before me. I could still hear her voice, calling out to me, demanding that I remember. But what was it I was supposed to remember? What was it that had been lost, that had been taken from her, from all of us? The rage in her eyes had burned through me, through everything I had known. It had branded itself into my memory, an indelible mark that would never fade. The tower had become her grave, her prison, her curse, and now it was mine. And there was no escaping it. I lay still in the darkness, feeling the weight of Anne's presence pressing down on me. I could not see her, but I knew she was there. In the shadows, in the walls, in the very air that I breathed. She was never truly gone. She was a part of the tower now, a part of me, and I would never be free of her. And as the night stretched on, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Asterisk, remember asterisk, they said. Asterisk, remember the rage. Asterisk, the curse of the tower would not let me forget. It had been laid upon me, and now, like Anne, I was trapped within its walls, condemned to live in the shadow of a past that could never be escaped. The tower has changed little since that day. The ancient stones still carry the imprints of history, the echoes of lives lived and ended within its oppressive walls. The very air of the tower, heavy with the weight of centuries, seems to breathe in the dark secrets it guards. The clamor of the past lingers in the stones like an invisible spectre, whispering of forgotten horrors. And yet, despite all of this, no one speaks of Anne of Cleves anymore. Her name has been swallowed by time, erased from history as if she had never been, as if her existence, her suffering, her very death had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in the grander narrative of the King's reign. No monument to her memory stands in the tower, no plaque, no tribute. It is as if she was a shadow, a mere footnote in the pages of history. The grandeur of her brief marriage to Henry VIII, her broken hopes, and the cruel punishment she endured, everything about her has faded into the forgotten corners of. The past, the world has moved on, leaving Anne behind like an old, forgotten story, lost to the ravages of time. But I know what I felt that day, what I heard, what I saw, the haunting finality of Anne's fate, the coldness in her eyes as she met her end, the rage and defiance that burned in her gaze, will never leave me. It has become etched into my memory, a mark that will never fade, no matter how far I go. It follows me, even now, like a shadow that refuses to leave my side. Anne's final warnings still echoes in my mind, a whisper I cannot escape. I hear it in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, when the world round me seems to fall away, and I am left alone with my thoughts. It is not a voice that has left me, it is a presence, a weight that presses down on my chest, reminding me of the curse she spoke of. Asterisk remember, asterisk she had whispered to me, asterisk remember what they did to me, asterisk that curse, I fear, has not been broken. It lingers in the spaces between breaths, in the quiet corners of my thoughts. And spirit, her rage, her agony, these are things that refuse to be forgotten. They were never truly hers to carry alone. They have become a part of the tower, a part of history, and, most tragically, they have become a part of me. I am far from the tower now, far from the cold stone and the haunting whispers. But in the stillness of my life, I carry the shadow of her curse with me. It is as if I have been marked by it, bound to her fate in some twisted, unbreakable way. The echoes of her suffering reverberate through me, and every night I hear them soft, insistent whispers that grow louder the longer I ignore them. Her story may have been forgotten by the world, but I will never forget. I cannot forget the eyes of the last woman to be executed by King Henry. Those eyes wide, unblinking, filled with a mixture of rage and something deeper, something beyond comprehension. They were not eyes of fear, not of a woman resigned to her fate, but eyes of a woman who knew the truth that the cruelty of the king could never be satisfied, and that even in death there would be no peace. I see those eyes every night, in the darkness, in the stillness of my room. Her gaze never wavers, never softens. It is as if she is still watching me, still waiting for me to understand something she never had the chance to explain. The curse, the anger, the injustice, it all lingers, festers, and refuses to die, and sometimes late at night, when I lie awake, unable to sleep, I can still hear her voice. It is faint, like the rustling of a distant breeze, but unmistakable. It calls to me from the depths of my mind, her voice scraping against my thoughts, urging me to remember, to understand what happened in that cold courtyard, under the shadow of the scaffold. It is as if she is still trapped there, her spirit unable to escape the confines of the tower, and she is reaching out, desperate for someone, anyone, to hear her. The curse of the tower is not just Anne's. It is the curse of all those who have died within these walls. The souls who have been betrayed by power, by greed, by the cruelty of kings and queens who ruled without mercy. Anne's death was not just her own. It was a symbol, a testament to the suffering of all those who were crushed beneath the weight of the crown. And I fear that I, too, have been bound to it, bound to her rage and her suffering in ways I cannot escape. The tower's ghosts do not rest. They linger, not in the physical realm, but in the minds of those who have borne witness to their fates. Their suffering echoes through the centuries, a reminder of the injustices that can never truly be erased. And in this silence, in this isolation, I am haunted by the truth of it all. The curse of the tower is real, and it is not just a thing of the past. It is a force that lives on, a living, breathing presence that continues to demand remembrance. I do not know how long it will follow me, how long the whispers will haunt my thoughts, how long Anne's ghost will remain in the corners of my mind. But I know one thing with certainty: I will never be free of it. Anne's fate has become my fate, her curse my own. And as the years pass, I know I will carry her with me, just as the tower will carry her. Her story may be forgotten by the world, but in my heart it will never fade. The last woman to be executed by Henry VIII did not die that day. No, she lives on in the shadows, in the whispers, and in the hearts of those who remember. And I will remember. Thank you for joining me in this hunting journey through history. Anne of Cleves' tragic story may have faded from the pages of time, but a curse lingers. A dark reminder of the price of betrayal and power. Her legacy, marked by rage and injustice, continues to echo through the centuries, a shadow that can never be erased. If you felt the chill of her story, if you've experienced the weight of her curse, please share your thoughts below. Your voice is part of keeping these stories alive. And as always, please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Anne's legacy and what her tragic fate means in the grand tapestry of history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There are many more chilling